The pen hadn't even touched the paper yet, but the world was already watching. In the grand hall of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, 28 heads of state sat at a horseshoe-shaped table that seemed to curve toward destiny itself. The cameras from CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, CGTN and RT were rolling. The translators in their boots were ready. The security detail was on edge, but at the center of it all, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood with a document that would birth a $3.2 trillion economy in a single afternoon. Not through conquest, not through aid, not through foreign investment, but through something far more powerful. African unity backed by African resources, guaranteed by African sovereignty, and protected by African resolve. The document was only 12 pages long. 12 pages that had taken 3 years to write, 57 drafts to perfect, and centuries of pain to necessitate. They called it the Wagadugu Charter, named after the city where the first secret meeting had taken place. But everyone knew it by another name, the document that killed neocolonialism. As Traoré raised his pen, his hand steady, despite the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders, he spoke into the absolute silence of the room. Today we signed not just a trade agreement but a declaration of economic independence. Today Africa stops asking for permission to be prosperous. The journey to this moment had begun 3 years earlier in a small conference room in Ouagadougou. Reporters, no fanfare, just Traoré and 4 other leaders, who had grown tired of watching their nation's wealth flow northward while their people remained poor. President Ami Goïta of Mali, Colonel Mohamed Doumbouya of Guinea, General Abdul Rahman Chani of Nigeria, and surprisingly, President William R. of Kenya. 5 men who had nothing in common except a shared realization. The current system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed. Designed to extract, designed to exploit, designed to ensure that African resources would forever subsidize Western prosperity. The first meeting lasted 18 hours. They reviewed the numbers that everyone knew but no one discussed publicly. Africa produced 75% of the world's cocoa but captured only 2% of the chocolate industry's value. Africa mined 70% of the world's cobalt, essential for electric vehicles and smartphones, but not a single African nation manufactured batteries. Africa grew 21% of the world's cocoa. The continent possessed 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, and 13% of the world's oil, yet remained the poorest region on Earth. These weren't statistics. They were symptoms of a disease that had infected the global economy for centuries. Traoré had pulled out a map, not a political map, but a resource map. It showed every mine, every oil field, every agricultural zone in Africa. Then he overlaid it with another map showing the ownership structures. The contrast was stark. Chinese companies controlled the cobalt. European corporations owned the gold mines. American firms managed the oil extraction. Middle Eastern interests ran the agricultural exports. Africa was rich, but Africans were poor. The diagnosis was clear. The prescription was radical. They needed to create a parallel economic system, not to destroy the existing one, but to compete with it, to offer African nations an alternative to the neocolonial structures that had trapped them for generations. The idea was audacious in its simplicity. Create a common market like the European Union, but built on different principles. No single currency that could be manipulated, no central bank that could be pressured, no political union that could be corrupted. Instead, a digital trade network backed by physical resources, verified by blockchain, and governed by algorithm rather than bureaucracy. Every member nation would contribute resources to a common reserve. Gold, oil, minerals, agricultural products. These reserves would back a digital trading currency used only for inter-off trade, not to replace national currencies, but to eliminate the need for dollars or euros in African commerce. But the masterstroke was the charter itself. Unlike traditional trade agreements that ran thousands of pages and required armies of lawyers to interpret, the Ouagadougou Charter was deliberately simple. 12 pages, 47 articles written in plain language that a high school student could understand. No loopholes, no ambiguity, no room for exploitation. The core principles were revolutionary. First, all natural resources extracted from member nations must undergo at least one stage of processing within Africa before export. Raw materials could no longer be shipped out wholesale. Second, any foreign company operating in member nations must have at least 51% local ownership and must transfer technology and skills to local workers. Third, all inter-region trade would be conducted in the new digital currency, bypassing dollar dependency entirely. The fourth principle was the most controversial: collective negotiation. When any external nation or corporation wanted to make a deal with one member, they had to negotiate with all members. No more divide and conquer. No more playing African nations against each other for the lowest price. If you wanted Congola's cobalt, you negotiated with the entire bloc. If you needed Nigerian oil, you faced the collective. If you sought Ghanaian gold, you dealt with the Union. This principle alone would transform global commodity markets. Instead of 34 individual African nations competing to offer the lowest prices, there would be one unified bloc setting terms. The Western response was predictable. When rumors of the Charter first leaked, European diplomats dismissed it as impossible. African nations were too diverse. They said too many conflicts, too much corruption, too little infrastructure. The International Monetary Fund published a report suggesting that such a union would collapse within months. The World Bank warned of economic isolation. The Financial Times ran an editorial calling it economic suicide. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand from their glass towers in London and Washington, was that for millions of Africans, the current system already felt like economic suicide. Slow, painful, generational economic suicide. As word spread through diplomatic channels, the pressure began. Presidents received phone calls from former colonial powers warning of consequences. Finance ministers were invited to conferences where they were lectured about the dangers of economic nationalism. Aid packages were suddenly reviewed. Military cooperation agreements were reconsidered. Trade preferences were threatened with cancellation. The message was clear. Abandon this foolish idea or face isolation. But True had anticipated this. In fact, he had counted on it. Every threat, every pressure tactic, every attempt at economic blackmail was carefully documented, not for legal action, but for propaganda. Each threat became a recruiting tool. Each pressure tactic proved the necessity of the Charter. Each attempt at blackmail demonstrated why Africa needed economic independence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. President Lorenzo of Angola, initially skeptical, had sent his best economists to analyze the proposal. Their report, which was supposed to discredit the idea, instead validated it. The numbers were undeniable. If just 15 African nations joined the bloc, they would control enough strategic resources to influence global prices. If 20 joined, they would become the world's third largest economy overnight. If 30 joined, they would rival the European Union in economic power. The report leaked, whether by accident or design, and suddenly every African capital was running similar analysis. The results were always the same. Unity meant power. Division meant continued poverty. The second meeting, 6 months after the first, had 15 participants. Word had spread through private channels. Presidents who publicly criticized the idea were secretly sending representatives. The discussion was no longer whether to create the union, but how. The technical challenges were immense. How do you create a digital currency that can't be hacked? How do you verify resource reserves without international auditors? How do you prevent corruption within the system? How do you build infrastructure to support continental trade? Each challenge required innovation. Each innovation required cooperation. Each cooperation built trust. Slowly, painfully, but inevitably, the framework emerged. The Chinese watched with interest. This wasn't necessarily bad for them. A unified African market meant simplified negotiations. A digital currency meant reduced transaction costs. Technology transfer requirements meant new markets for Chinese equipment and expertise. Quietly through back channels, they signaled that they could work with this new system. The Russians were even more enthusiastic. Anything that weakened Western economic hegemony aligned with their interests. They offered technical support for the digital infrastructure, military cooperation for security, and most importantly, recognition and legitimacy in international forums. But the real validation came from an unexpected source, the African diaspora. When details of the Charter leaked on social media, Africans living abroad went wild. Tech workers in Silicon Valley started volunteering their expertise. Bankers in London began quietly transferring knowledge. Academics in Beijing offered to return home. The brain drain that had weakened Africa for decades suddenly reversed. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to matter. Enough to notice, enough to panic Western corporations who suddenly faced the prospect of losing their African talent pools. The third meeting 1 year after the first was no longer secret. 23 nations sent representatives. The African Development Bank, long criticized as toothless, suddenly found its teeth. It announced a $100 billion fund to support Charter implementation. The money came from an unexpected source, sovereign wealth funds from oil-producing African nations that had been investing in Western markets. The funds were repatriated not as capital flight, but as capital return. The message was clear. Africa would fund its own development. The technical infrastructure took 2 years to build. It was a marvel of modern engineering. Not physical, but digital. The trade network ran on quantum encrypted servers distributed across the continent. Each transaction was verified by nodes in multiple countries, making hacking virtually impossible. The digital currency called the Africa wasn't mined like cryptocurrency, but was created based on verified resource deposits. When Nigeria added oil to the reserve, Africas were created. When Congo contributed cobalt, more Africas entered circulation. When Ethiopia provided coffee, the digital economy expanded. It was a currency backed not by faith or force, but by physical wealth. The testing phase began with small transactions. Kenya bought oil from Nigeria using Africa. Payment was instant. No dollar conversion, no international bank fees, no Western intermediaries taking their cut. The savings were substantial, almost 7% per transaction. When multiplied across thousands of transactions, the numbers became staggering. Billions of dollars that had been leaked through financial friction suddenly stayed in Africa. Ghana tested the system by selling gold to Egypt. South Africa bought agricultural products from Tanzania. Each successful transaction built confidence. Each confident nation attracted another member. The moment of truth came when a European electronics manufacturer needed cobalt for its battery factory. Under the old system, they would have negotiated directly with the Democratic Republic of Congo, probably getting the raw material for a fraction of its true value. Under the charter, they faced the entire bloc. The negotiation took 3 months. The final price was 340% higher than what they had paid previously. But here was the genius. The price was still competitive with other sources because African cobalt was higher quality and more ethically sourced. The manufacturer agreed, but with one condition. They wanted to build the battery factory in Africa. The charter members agreed, but with their own condition. The factory would be 51% African-owned and would train African engineers. A deal was struck. A precedent was set. A new economic order was born. As success stories multiplied, more nations wanted in, but Traoré insisted on maintaining standards. Membership wasn't automatic. Nations had to meet certain criteria, corruption indices below certain thresholds, democratic governance structures, commitment to human rights, investment in education. These weren't arbitrary requirements, but necessary foundations for the system to work. A corrupt nation could poison the entire network. An autocratic government could use the system for oppression. The charter wasn't just about economic union, but about African renaissance. The Western media initially ignored the story, then mocked it, then attacked it, and finally reluctantly acknowledged it. The Economist ran a cover story, The African Century, how 28 nations built a $3.2 trillion economy. The number was conservative. When you calculated the value of resources, the size of the internal market, the potential for growth, the real number was closer to 5 trillion, but 3.2 trillion was what could be verified, measured, and proven. It was enough. Enough to demand respect, enough to attract investment, enough to change the conversation from how can we help Africa to how can we partner with Africa. The signing ceremony had been planned for months. Every detail scrutinized, every symbol considered. The location was significant. Addis Ababa, the seat of the African Union, the city where African independence had first been declared. The date was significant, May 25th, Africa Day, the anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. The time was significant, 12 o'clock noon, when the sun stood highest in the African sky. Everything was choreographed to send a message. Africa was rising, and this time it would not be stopped. The 28 nations represented every region of the continent: North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Ivory Coast, East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Central Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, Gabon, Chad, Southern Africa, South Africa, Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique. Together they represented 1.1 billion people, 70% of Africa's population. They controlled 80% of Africa's natural resources. They generated 85% of Africa's GDP. This wasn't a splinter group. This was the continental majority. As each leader signed the charter, they made a brief statement. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa spoke of correcting historical injustices. President Hakainde Hichilema of Zambia talked about future generations. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana quoted Kwame Nkrumah. President Macky Sall of Senegal spoke in poetry. But it was Traoré's statement that would be remembered, quoted, studied and debated for generations. He stood at the podium, looked directly into the cameras, and spoke in French, English, Arabic, and Swahili, repeating the same message in each language. For centuries, they told us we were poor. We believed them even as they carried away our gold. They told us we were backward. We believed them even as they used our minerals to build their technology. They told us we needed their help. We believed them even as that help came with chains. Today we stop believing their lies. Today we start believing in ourselves. Today Africa writes its own story. And that story begins with a simple truth. We are not poor, we never were. We were robbed, but the robbery ends now. The applause lasted 17 minutes, but even as the leaders celebrated, Traoré knew the real work was just beginning. Signing the charter was symbolic. Implementing it would be war, not a military war, but an economic war, a psychological war, a war for the narrative of Africa's future. The old powers wouldn't give up easily. They had too much to lose. The exploitation of Africa wasn't a side business for Western prosperity. It was foundational. Without cheap African resources, entire industries would collapse. Without African markets, growth would stagnate. Without African poverty to contrast with, how would they define their wealth? The first test came within days. 3 major credit rating agencies simultaneously downgraded the sovereign ratings of all charter members. The official reason was increased economic uncertainty. The real reason was punishment. The message was clear: play by our rules or we'll make borrowing impossible. But True had anticipated this too. The charter included provisions for internal rating system. African nations would rate each other based on real economic fundamentals, not political compliance. More importantly, the need for external borrowing would decrease as internal trade increased. Why borrow dollars at 15% interest when you could trade Afris at 0 interest? The second test was more serious. Several multinational corporations announced they were reviewing their African operations. This was economic hostage-taking. Either abandon the charter or we'll take our jobs and leave. But something unexpected happened. For every Western corporation that threatened to leave, 3 Asian companies offered to enter. Chinese firms saw opportunity in the technology transfer requirements. Indian companies appreciated the large unified market. Turkish businesses recognized the infrastructure potential. Brazilian agricultural companies understood the value of South-South cooperation. The multipolar world that had been theoretical suddenly became practical. The currency markets were the third battlefield. Speculators began attacking the currencies of charter members, trying to create chaos that would force them to seek IMF assistance. But the charter had prepared for this. A $500 billion stabilization fund contributed by all members and managed by algorithm, rather than politics, automatically intervened when any member currency came under attack. The speculators used to picking off individual nations found themselves, by fighting the entire bloc, they lost billions. Some went bankrupt, the attack stopped, the message had been received. Africa would defend itself. 6 months after the signing, the first major success story emerged. The African Battery Initiative, a joint venture between 7 charter nations, produced its first lithium-ion battery. It wasn't just any battery, it was cheaper than Chinese alternatives, more efficient than European models, and most importantly, 100% African made, from the cobalt mined in Congo to the lithium from Zimbabwe to the assembly in Rwanda to the software from Nigeria. Every component was African. The symbolic value was immense, but the practical value was greater. Africa had entered the value chain not at the bottom but at the middle. The climb to the top had begun. The agricultural transformation was even more dramatic. Instead of exporting raw coffee beans for $2 per kilogram and importing instant coffee for $20 per kilogram, African nations began processing their own agricultural products. Ethiopian coffee, Ivorian cocoa, Kenyan tea, South African wine, all processed, packaged and branded in Africa. The value capture was extraordinary. Farmers who had struggled for generations suddenly found themselves earning living wages. Rural communities that had been emptying as youth fled to cities began revitalizing. Agriculture, long seen as backward, became attractive again. The infrastructure development was perhaps the most visible change. The Trans-African Railway, a dream since independence, suddenly had funding, not from external loans, but from internal resources. The railway would connect Cairo to Cape Town, Dakar to Djibouti, creating the backbone for continental trade built by African companies using African steel, employing African workers, funded by African capital. Every kilometer of track laid was a kilometer of independence gained. The projected completion time was 10 years. The actual completion time would be 7. When you're building for yourself rather than for others, motivation makes a difference. The education revolution was quieter, but equally profound. The charter required each member to spend at least 20% of their budget on education. But more importantly, it required curriculum reform. African history would be taught from African perspectives. Science would include African innovations. Literature would celebrate African authors. Mathematics would use African examples. The goal wasn't to exclude the world, but to include Africa, to ensure that African children grew up knowing that they were descendants of greatness, capable of greatness, destined for greatness. The healthcare transformation saved lives and built wealth simultaneously. Instead of importing generic drugs at branded prices, Char nations began producing their own pharmaceuticals. The Congo-Zambia pharmaceutical complex became the largest medicine manufacturer in the southern hemisphere. The Nigerian Vaccine Initiative produced CO-19 vaccines that were distributed across Africa at cost. The Kenyan Medical Device Innovation Hub created diagnostic equipment designed for African conditions. Healthcare, long a drain on African economies, through expensive imports became a source of export revenue. The digital revolution was perhaps the most unexpected success. Africa's young population, often cited as a challenge, became its greatest asset. With 60% of the population under 25, Africa had the world's largest pool of digital natives. The Charter's investment in digital infrastructure paid off spectacularly. African fintech companies began competing globally. African gaming studios created content that dominated international markets. African AI researchers, no longer brain drained to Silicon Valley, created algorithms that solved African problems and then sold those solutions globally. The narrative of Africa as technologically backward died a quick death. The cultural renaissance followed economic success. Mollywood, already the world's second largest film industry by volume, gained the capital to increase quality. African music from Afrobeats to Amapiano dominated global charts. African fashion weeks in Lagos, Dhaka and Johannesburg became as important as Paris or Milan. African literature funded by new publishing houses won international prizes. African art no longer looted or undervalued commanded premium prices. Culture long exported for free became a significant revenue generator. The environmental leadership surprised everyone, including Africans themselves. The charter included the world's strictest environmental protections, not because of external pressure, but because African nations understood that their natural wealth included their natural beauty. The Congo Basin, the world's second largest rainforest, became a global carbon sink that nations paid to preserve. African solar and wind projects powered by abundant sun and wind began exporting clean energy to Europe. The narrative of Africa as an environmental victim transformed into Africa as an environmental leader. The financial architecture evolved rapidly. The African Central Bank distributed across multiple capitals to prevent capture, managed the Africa with algorithmic precision. The African Investment Bank, funded by resource revenues, provided capital for development projects. The African Stock Exchange, fully digital and blockchain verified, became the world's fastest growing capital market. Financial inclusion enabled by mobile technology reached 90% of the population. The unbanked became banked, the excluded became included, the informal became formal. The governance improvements were gradual but real. The Charter's requirements for membership created positive peer pressure. Nations reformed not because outsiders demanded it, but because their neighbors expected it. Corruption decreased not because of foreign oversight, but because of citizen empowerment. Democracy strengthened not through imported models, but through indigenous innovations. The Ubuntu principle of collective responsibility merged with modern governance to create something new. African democracy rooted in African values, serving African people. The military cooperation was defensive but effective. The African Defense Alliance, modeled on NATO but without external leadership, created collective security. French military bases closed. American drone bases shut down. Foreign military presence, uninvited and unwanted, ended. African forces trained by Africans, equipped by African industries, defended African interests. The principle was simple. African solutions to African problems. The practice was complex but successful. Terrorism decreased. Piracy ended. Border conflicts resolved through mediation rather than violence. The space program captured imaginations globally. The African Space Agency, headquartered in Nigeria with launch facilities in Kenya, put its first satellite into orbit using a rocket manufactured in South Africa with guidance systems from Egypt. The satellite didn't just relay communications or monitor weather. It surveyed mineral deposits, tracked agricultural yields, monitored deforestation, and provided internet to rural areas. Space, long the domain of superpowers, became accessible to Africa. The psychological impact was immeasurable. African children, who had looked up at the stars, now knew they could reach them. The diplomatic revolution was subtle but significant. African nations began voting as a bloc in international forums. With 54 votes in the United Nations, Africa became the decisive voice on global issues. Security Council reform, long blocked, suddenly became possible when Africa made it a condition for cooperation on other matters. Climate change negotiations shifted when Africa, contributing least to the problem, but suffering most from its effects, demanded justice rather than charity. International law evolved when African legal scholars educated in African universities challenged Western interpretations. The soft power projection was masterful. The African News Network, broadcasting in 12 languages, provided African perspectives on global events. African universities attracted international students with affordable, quality education. African hospitals became medical tourism destinations. African sports leagues drew global audiences. African technology conferences became Mustatante events. The narrative of Africa as a recipient of soft power transformed into Africa as a projector of soft power. The economic numbers told the story. GDP growth averaged 8.7% across charter nations. Inflation fell to 3.2%. Unemployment dropped from 23% to 11%. Poverty decreased by 40%. Life expectancy increased by 7 years. Infant mortality halved. Literacy reached 85%. Internet penetration hit 75%. These weren't just statistics. They were lives improved, dreams realized, potential fulfilled. Behind every number was a human story of transformation, but perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The African inferiority complex, carefully cultivated over centuries of colonization and decades of neocolonialism, began to heal. African children grew up seeing African success, African entrepreneurs stopped trying to immigrate and started trying to innovate. African leaders stopped begging and started negotiating. African nations stopped competing and started cooperating. The mindset shifted from survival to success, from dependency to dignity, from periphery to center. 3 years after the signing, Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly. The boy from Burkina Faso who had become a soldier, who had become a president, who had become a revolutionary, now spoke as the rotating chairman of the African Economic Union. His speech was broadcast live across Africa in villages without electricity. People gathered around solar-powered radios in cities. Crowds watched on giant screens. In diaspora communities, Africans organized viewing parties. This wasn't just a speech, it was a victory lap. 3 years ago, Traoré began. We signed a document, not a plea for help, not a request for aid, not a promise to behave. We signed a declaration of economic independence. Today I stand before